African history has been deliberately hidden, stolen, and distorted by the establishment for thousands of years. Within the last 100 years, Black scholars have made a tremendous effort to uncover, recover, and clarify the facts of Black history. This educational video is part of this continuing effort to share factual information and significant contributions made by these Black scholars, such as Sheikh Anta Diop, Runoko Rashidi, Charles S. Finch III, Clyde A. Winters, David Imhotep, and history-changing Guyanese scholars George G.M. James and Ivan Van Sertima. This video is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is this introduction. Part 2 provides the background information about each question, followed by the question, which is repeated 2 times. Part 3 provides the answers to the questions. There are 7 questions and answers on this video. Here is some background information for question number 1. This question is about the origin of modern-day human beings. It is known that all human beings alive today, regardless of whether you consider yourself to be African, Amerindian, Chinese, Portuguese, East Indian, or white, we all have our origins in Africa about 200,000 years ago. We are all Afro-descendants. Question number 1 is, what is the current name of the country in Africa where scientists found the evidence of our earliest ancestors? To repeat the question, what is the current name of the country in Africa where scientists found the evidence of our earliest ancestors? The answer to this question and the 6 questions that follow are provided at the end of the video. Today's question is about the Black African influence on the foundation of Western European civilization. In the year 711 of the Common Era, or 711 AD, an army of Arabic-speaking Black people from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from Africa to Spain. They went on to conquer Spain and Portugal. The area is called the Iberian Peninsula. They occupied and governed the Iberian Peninsula for more than 750 years. That is, 750 years. During this period, these Black people brought civilization to Spain and Portugal, including formal education, books, manuscripts, and made public libraries, health science and medicine, agriculture, knowledge of shipbuilding, the oceans, and navigation. They built castles and cities with paved streets and street lights and mosques. They built houses with running water and waste disposal systems. These Black people created a standard of living in Spain and Portugal that was the envy of all of Europe. The rest of Europe was considered to be no more than stables. During this time, the major city in Spain, Toledo, was known as a city of translators, where thousands of scholars translated the Arabic texts into all the European languages. These books were then sent to the European countries. This was the educational foundation for renowned European universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. This is how the Europeans got their formal education and civilization, from these Arabic-speaking Black North Africans who conquered and governed Portugal and Spain for more than 750 years until 1492 CE. In 1492, the Spanish and Portuguese and their allies committed genocide on these black people. Those not murdered were banished from the Iberian Peninsula. Some of the banished folks went back to Africa, but others went to other European countries, particularly France, England, and Germany, and became their nobility, that is, knights and ladies in those countries, until they were also betrayed by these white folks and sent as slaves and free people to the West, or were robbed of their identity. This identity theft is still going on today. Europeans have since that time been trying to write their history without acknowledging the significant contributions of these black Arabic-speaking folks that crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, conquered and governed for more than 750 years the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal, and brought civilization and formal education to the rest of Europe. So, here is the question. Who are these black Arabic-speaking people from North Africa who brought education to Spain and Portugal, and through Spain created the foundation of Western European culture and civilization? To repeat, who are these black Arabic-speaking people from North Africa who brought education to Spain and Portugal, and through Spain created the foundation of Western European culture and civilization? Today's question is about the African-Egyptian foundation of Western civilization. The term African-Egyptian is used here to make a clear distinction between the African and the Arab Egyptian. The Arabs controlling Egypt today are very new arrivals to Egypt, and therefore cannot be credited with making any contribution whatsoever to the creation of the ancient African-Egyptian civilization. The wonders of ancient Egypt are all African. It is known that for thousands of years, the African Egyptians created, documented, and stored an impressive body of information in temples and libraries, like the African Egyptian Royal Library in the city of Rakotis, a major Egyptian seaport on the Mediterranean Sea. Rakotis, later renamed Alexandria, was like a university city of that era, and the Egyptian mystery schools and temples provided the higher education. The African Egyptian education system had to provide a comprehensive body of knowledge needed to build and sustain the sophisticated culture that built structures such as the pyramids of Giza, that even today scholars do not understand how and why these structures were built. This comprehensive body of knowledge that was required to build and sustain this sophisticated culture is the legacy of African Egyptians to civilization. Like hundreds of other non-Africans, the following notables, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, received an African education and returned to Greece to practice what they learned from the African Egyptian education system. As adult students studying in Africa for many years, scholars were very much aware of the wealth of information housed in the African Egyptian Royal Library at Rakotis. Around 332 BCE, the Greek army, led by Alexander the Great, invaded Egypt, sacked the city of Rakotis, and looted the African Egyptian Royal Library. The Greeks renamed the city Alexandria after Alexander the Great and stayed there for several hundred years until they were expelled from Alexandria by the Romans around 32 BCE. During their stay in Egypt, they used the resources of the African Egyptian Royal Library at Alexandria and other libraries in Egypt to educate generations of Greeks and others, who, in some cases, were later considered to be the fathers of the subjects they spent years learning as students in Africa. In modern times, it is widely recognized that a comprehensive body of knowledge retrieved from the African Egyptian education system, including the Egyptian temples and libraries, provided the foundation of Western civilization. Here is the question. What is the name of the Greek philosopher who received an African Egyptian education, became Alexander the Great's teacher, and then went to Egypt with Alexander the Great and his army and looted the contents of the African Egyptian Royal Library in Rakotis? To repeat the question, what is the name of the Greek philosopher who received an African Egyptian education, became Alexander the Great's teacher, and then went to Egypt with Alexander the Great and his army and looted the contents of the African Egyptian Royal Library in Rakotis? This question is about Ethiopia, located in Eastern Africa, as shown in the picture on the screen. Ethiopia is not one big happy family. This slide identifies some of the larger groups and their traditional territory. There are three major ethnic groups that make up most of the population in Ethiopia. They are the Oromo, the Amhara, and the Tigrayans. The largest ethnic group of about 30 million people makes up about 38% of the total Ethiopian population. These 30 million people are the original Kushite stock and speak original Kushite languages. These folks have their own territory in Ethiopia, their own calendar, which is not the 7-day Christian calendar, their own supreme God, and establish traditional ancient religious practice, which is not related to Christianity and not related to Islam. This ethnic group of about 30 million people is like an ancient African civilization within Ethiopia. Here is the question. In Ethiopia, what is the name of the largest ethnic group of about 30 million people of original Kushite stock who maintain their traditional culture, who have their own calendar, speak their own Kushite languages, named their supreme God, and practice their own established traditional religion, which is not related to Christianity and also not related to Islam? To repeat the question, in Ethiopia, what is the name of the largest ethnic group of about 30 million people of original Kushite stock who maintain their traditional culture, who have their own calendar, speak their own Kushite languages, name their supreme God, and practice their own established traditional religion, which is not related to Christianity and also not related to Islam? Remember, this question relates to the influence of ancient African civilization on Asia. Just as there was a time when ancient Egyptian civilization was all African, there was a time when Asia and areas east of Africa did not have any so-called white people or Mongol-type people either. In fact, recent migration studies have shown that there is no evidence to support any theories about a massive Aryan invasion or Aryan migration around 1500 BCE or any other time. Further, the area now called India was once known as Eastern Ethiopia. Because it is now accepted that ancient peoples east of Africa, particularly those in Southern Asia, came directly out of Africa. A current term for these folks collectively is Afro-Asiatics. This question then pertains to the ancient Afro-Asiatics civilizations prior to the current period. The current period is characterized by 1. The systematic destruction of evidence of the former existence of former Great Black Afro-Asiatic civilization in the region. 2. Others claiming the history of the black peoples as their own history, rewriting and modifying this history without acknowledging that it is black history. And 3. Genocide of black people. Prior to the beginning of this period, the names of places of the region were a reflection of the people who lived there. For example, Sindhu Kush Mountains were named after Kush, Africa, and the Kunlun Mountains were named after the Kunlun, which literally means the black people. Like the black people who created the first Chinese civilization, the Shang civilization, east of the Kunlun Mountains, or Black People's Mountains. At that time, ancient peoples of Southeast Asia were also black people, like the ancient Funan, Khmer, and Champa. So, here is the question. Considering the current scientific information confirming that ancient African and Afro-Asiatic peoples and civilizations originated in East Africa, what is the name of the major river in East Africa that played a key role during the development and expansion of ancient African and Afro-Asiatic civilization? To repeat the question, considering the current scientific information confirming that ancient African and Afro-Asiatic peoples and civilizations originated in East Africa, what is the name of the major river in East Africa that played a key role during the development and expansion of ancient African and Afro-Asiatic civilization? This question is about the influence of black Africans of the ancient Americas. It is now known that when so-called white Europeans like Christopher Columbus came to the Americas, they found millions of thriving, resident, indigenous black peoples from Africa living all over North, Central, and South America. These black peoples were not and never were slaves of the Europeans. These included the Olmecs, the Darianites, Washitas, Yamasis, Chocos, and others. Ancestors of these black peoples were the first people to inhabit the Americas. These black peoples interbred with the Mongolians, who came later and formed the current indigenous Amerindian population in the Americas. In ancient times, these black people traveled out of Africa by walking and on boats, which they made. They used the ocean currents to explore all over the world long before the so-called white people surfaced. These indigenous black peoples in the Americas initially welcomed the white people, but later realized that they came as invaders and not traders. They fought the European invaders until the late 1800s, but were eventually overcome and were blended into the population of Africans being brought from Africa during the infamous period in history known as the African Holocaust. History books have since that time been lying to try to convince black people that all black people were slaves brought by the white Europeans to the Americas, and to sustain the lie that black people had no history before slavery. Now, however, there is a lot of evidence to prove that black people were resident in the Americas long before the white Europeans and Christopher Columbus arrived there. Several scholars and authors have written books that provide considerable additional credible evidence which proves that Africans are indigenous and were resident in the Americas long before Columbus was born, and that they have contributed significantly to the development of the Americas, both as free people before Columbus and as slaves. So here is the question. What is the name of the famous Guyanese scholar and author whose picture is on the screen? He, 1, wrote extensively about the presence of Africans in the Americas before Columbus, including the book titled They Came Before Columbus. 2, he was asked to go before the Congress of the United States to prove his point. And 3, he made this history-changing speech before Congress, after which it was accepted that Columbus never discovered America. He just visited the Americas long after Africans and Amerindians were already resident in the Americas. To repeat the question, what is the name of the famous Guyanese scholar and author whose picture is on the screen? He, 1, wrote extensively about the presence of Africans in the Americas before Columbus, including the book titled They Came Before Columbus. 2, he was asked to go before the Congress of the United States to prove his point. And 3, he made this history-changing speech before Congress, after which it was accepted that Columbus never discovered America. He just visited the Americas long after Africans and Amerindians were already resident in the Americas. This question is about how black people got into slavery and about black people freeing themselves from physical and mental slavery. History has shown that several methods are used to get black people into slavery, and several ways are used to try to encourage black people to recognize slavery and do something about it if they want to be free. A famous black freedom fighter named Harriet Tubman helped develop secret land escape routes to take thousands of people who knew they were slaves away from slavery to freedom. More than 60,000 used the routes shown to go from the United States to Canada. The system of escape routes shown on the map was called the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman personally led many groups of people herself. Harriet Tubman said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." On the other hand, slave ships and ocean currents were used to get black people from West Africa into slavery in the Americas. Sir John Hawkins started the African Holocaust for the British. His was the first British ship to bring slaves from Africa to the Americas. He used the biggest ship he could find to transport about 300 black people from West Africa into slavery in the Americas. There are several famous quotes about how black people got into slavery and about getting themselves out of slavery. A famous person once said, "It is difficult to free fools from chains they revere," meaning about the same thing as Harriet Tubman, who said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more, if only they knew they were slaves." Both quotes basically mean it is hard to free someone from slavery by escape routes on land, like Harriet Tubman did, or by any means whatsoever if they don't recognize slavery, or worse, if they revere or worship the chains around their necks that keep them enslaved. Here is the question. Sir John Hawkins started the African Holocaust for the British. He was the first British captain to bring about 300 slaves from Africa to the Americas. What was his slave ship known as? To repeat the question, Sir John Hawkins started the African Holocaust for the British. He was the first British captain to bring about 300 slaves from Africa to the Americas. What was his slave ship known as?